Building a commander deck is a process of precision. Perhaps most precarious of all is the proper proportions of your commander deck's mana base. Knowing the ratio of lands to spells is often not enough. For a 4-color commander mana base, how many lands should be shock lands, dual lands, or just basic lands?
Hello? Prof? Hello? Prof?
I can't hear you over the music.
Huh? Oh, sorry, let me turn it down.
Okay, what's this about?
I'm calling because I need to do my 4-color mana base video, but we've never had 4-color commanders before.
Just do what you did for the other mana base videos.
I can't! What I did before was I researched existing mana bases. I tested deck after deck of commanders in those colors, read article after article written by experts. None of that exists for 4-color.
I don't know, just, figure it out.
Well, duh, that's what I'm trying to do by calling you. So tell me how a 4-color mana base should go.
So you want me to do your work for you?
Hey, I'm a professor. I can't come up with stuff on my own. What I do is I take the work that other people have done, and then I present it in an accessible way. Do you think a physics professor came up with whatever science-y thing they're lecturing on? No, some expert discovered it, and they regurgitate it.
Regurgitate?
Mm-hmm, like a mother bird to her young.
All right, what do you need?
Just tell me how to build an optimum 4-color mana base with footnotes on budget options.
Okay, sure, no problem.
Sir, you are truly a gentleman and a scholar and the Commander Master. Thanks again, Jimmy.
Wait, what? This is Josh.
Josh? Oh, crap. Is Jimmy there?
No. He's in the tub.
Fine, okay, I guess you'll have to do the one who isn't on Netflix.
Hey, well, at least I'll get the basic math correct.
Fair point.
The first thing we need to do when building a 4-color mana base is ask ourselves some questions, starting with, what is the color balance of my deck? Meaning, how many cards of each color do I have? Most decks use around 38 lands and 61 non-lands. For the non-lands, you will almost never have an even split between all 4 colors. Generally, 1 or 2 colors will be favored, while the remaining colors will be represented in lower numbers. One of the big things to pay attention to here is the color green. This is because one of green's strengths in the color pie is mana, and so it has more tools at its disposal to help out our mana base. Keeping this in mind, we can break the discussion down into 2 kinds of decks. The first are decks with either a small amount of green or no green at all, and the second are decks with a mid to high amount of green. Let's begin by talking about the low green or greenless decks. For the sake of keeping this realistic and reasonable for most people, we will not be including the original dual lands like Volcanic Island and Tundra in our discussion. Obviously, if you have those, use them. The closest analog to the dual lands that the average player does have access to are the shock lands. Now, each 4-color deck will have 6 shock lands in its colors. We highly suggest including every single one. What makes the shock lands special is threefold. 1, they tap for 2 different colors of mana. 2, they can always enter the battlefield untapped, as long as you can pay the 2 life. And 3, they contain 2 land types. Stomping Grounds, for instance, is a mountain forest, while Godless Shrine is a plain swamp. What this means is that they work with the fetch lands. Now, we're talking about the Zendikar and Onslaught fetch lands here. Cards like Polluted Delta, which say, search your library for an island or swamp and put it onto the battlefield. Note 2 things. 1, both Polluted Delta and the land it finds enter the battlefield untapped. And 2, it does not say basic island or swamp. Because of this, the fetch lands can find the shock lands. The utility of this combination is extremely powerful in 4-color decks. It means any of your fetch lands can find any color you might be missing at the time. Let's say you draw that Polluted Delta, but you need red mana. No problem. Just go find Steam Vents, which is the red-blue shock land. Because of this interaction, it is even possible to run all 10 fetch lands, even though some of them can only find 1 land type in your deck. For instance, if you're building the greenless mana base, that means you have no forests. But you could still run Wooded Foothills because it can always fetch for the color, paired with red, that you're missing. This is allowed through a small loophole in the rules for Commander. Because fetch lands do not have any mana symbols, they are allowed to be played outside of your color identity. Now, I'm only recommending you run 6 fetch lands here total, mostly because we want to keep the budget somewhat reasonable, and these can get a little pricey, especially the ones from original Zendikar. But you can definitely up that number depending on what your card availability is. It's ironic to note that the 4-color mana base is actually more complicated than the 5-color. In 5-color, you put in 10 shock lands and 10 fetch lands, and you're more than halfway done right there. With only 6 of each, we're currently below 1/3 of the lands we need for the 4-color deck. To fill in this gap, I like to use a smattering of Pain and Filter lands. The Pain lands are cards like Shivan Reef or Yavimaya Coast. They give you 3 options. Either they tap for colorless mana, or they tap for one of 2 different colors, but then you take 1 damage. This honestly sounds a lot worse than it is. For one, in Commander we start with 40 life, so 1 damage is inherently less impactful. And secondly, once you get to the later portions of the game, you usually tap these for the colorless mana option because by then you have other lands to give you the colors you need. So maybe you take a few damage in the early game, but that's it. The biggest downside of these is that they don't have land types, and therefore cannot be fetched. The Odyssey Filter lands also cannot be fetched, but they have a different issue. Cards like Shadowblood Ridge and Sungrass Prairie take a generic mana and turn it into 2 mana of a specific allied color pairing. This seems okay until you have an opening hand with just 1 land and you can't cast Soul Ring because it's a filter land and does not make mana on its own. Or let's say you have a spell that costs double mana, like Counterspell, but the only lands you have are an Island and Skycloud Expanse. Awkward. This is why I only advocate running 3 filter lands. That way, you minimize your exposure to these types of situations. I also like to run 3 Pain lands to minimize the damage. Next, let's talk basic lands. This is an area we're going to have to skimp. I like to run 9. This is usually in a 3-3-2-1 or a 4-2-2-1 configuration. Basically, I want to favor the colors that are most essential to my deck while also making sure I have at least 1 of each basic land type represented, obviously excluding the color that's not in my deck. This can be a little scary because there is a possibility of running into non-basic land hate like Blood Moon and Back to Basics. My philosophy is that as long as I have a couple of basic lands out on the battlefield, I can use disenchant type effects to get rid of those cards, and then I'm back on track. Admittedly, cards like Ruination can be a bit of an issue, but I'd rather deal with that rarity than the problem of being color screwed more often because I ran more basics and just didn't happen to draw the correct colors. If your playgroup or meta sees a lot of non-basic land hate, I would definitely increase the number of basics. Up next, I want to include 2 of the have lands. These are the ones from Battle for Zendikar that say, enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. This may seem counterintuitive after I just suggested playing so few basics, but bear with me here. For one, these lands have land types, much like the shock lands. So you're getting 2 more lands that you can fetch for. This is particularly useful for spells in your deck that have 2 or 3 mana symbols of the same color in their casting cost. In addition, sometimes you will have the 2 basic lands required to come in untapped, and if not, maybe you can just play one of these on turn 1 when you don't have a 1-drop spell to cast anyway. All in all, I think the tempo loss can be minimized a good portion of the time, and the upside of being able to fetch is worth it. The only cards I'm recommending that just straight up will enter the battlefield tapped are Tri-lands. The upside is that they create 3 different colors of mana. The downside is loss of tempo, but it's not as bad as it seems. As I mentioned earlier, you can often find a spot to play a single land tapped that won't cost you much, if anything. Maybe you put it out as your 5th land, but you only have a 4-drop spell to play anyway. Maybe you put it down on turn 1, as I said before. The real issue comes when you use quite a few lands like this, and they're just entering the battlefield tapped turn after turn after turn. Like most things, they're best in moderation, which is why I'm recommending only 2, and of course favor the colors that you have the most of in your deck. The last few lands are the catch-all and no-brainers. Command Tower is obvious. Exotic Orchard is going to be very, very good. I would choose either City of Brass or Mana Confluence. On the surface, they seem similar to the Pain lands, but there's no option to tap them for colorless for free. Certainly, you could run both, but the damage from these does add up. That puts our count at 34, and I'm going to leave 4 slots open for colorless utility lands. Temple of the False Gods is almost certainly one of them. Many people like to run Reliquary Tower, Strip Mine, Homeward Path, Winding Canyons, the list goes on. I'll let you decide which work best in your decks and for your meta, but the thing to keep in mind is that the more colors you run, the less room you have for lands that don't tap for color. As a side note, I would say that cards like Maze of Ith and Glacial Chasm are not considered lands for the purpose of this calculation, since they don't normally create mana and they function more like spells. Okay, let's talk budget really quickly. The thing to think about when you're substituting cheaper lands for the more expensive ones is to keep track of the tempo change. This means the number of lands in the deck that must enter play tapped. If you take out a shock land and replace it with a scry land, your deck is going to be a little slower. This is because you took out a land that can come into play untapped and put in one that only comes in tapped. If you do this a lot, it can make a big difference in how the deck plays. To combat this, when replacing shocks, I would try to use basics or pain or filter lands so that my tempo doesn't take a big hit. Fetches are more complicated to replace because all of the possible analogs are slower tempo-wise. This is okay. Right now we're pretty optimized with untapped lands, and we have room to put in maybe 5 to 6 slower options if we want without noticing too much. The slow fetches from Mirage are great candidates to substitute for the regular fetch lands. They work basically the same way, but they come into play tapped and don't cost you a life. Other cards that are just fine are the check lands, the vivid lands, and Terramorphic Expanse or Evolving Wilds. You could also use an additional 1 or 2 more tri-lands without losing too much steam. Bounce lands are also fine in moderation. Having said all of this, my general rule of thumb is I don't want to have more than 10 lands in the entire deck that must come into play tapped. Finally, let's talk about acceleration or ramp for our deck. These cards are part of our mana base, but they are not lands. The first thing to think about when choosing cards like this is, what's the converted mana cost of my commander, and do I want to cast him as soon as possible every game, or can I wait? With Commander 2016, we might have 2 commanders in the command zone, which could make this doubly important. Why so, you ask? Well, let's consider that about 1/3 of the new legendaries have a converted mana cost of 4 mana. This means that I'm heavily incentivized towards ramp and acceleration cards that cost 2 mana or less. The reason for this is that if I get an extra mana on board on turn 2, then on turn 3 I drop my land, and I now have 4 mana available to me, and I can hopefully cast my commander a full turn early. Obviously, which colors I have is a factor, but I've always found having a 3-drop commander and also having acceleration that costs 3 mana is super awkward. Basically, unless my commander costs 5 or more, I want my ramp cards to cost 2 mana whenever possible. As a result, I'm a big fan of the Signets. It's 2 CMC mana ramp in all the 2-color pairings. I think Felwar Stone is also very good once you're 3-color or above. There are also the Talisman, which are sort of Painland versions of the Signets, and I think those are playable too. Now, even after my little rant about 3 mana accelerants, I still think Chromatic Lantern deserves a spot. Making all of your lands tap for 5 color is just great, given that it also taps itself for mana, so it's ramp. And going back to a previous point, if I did have the Lantern in my deck, I would definitely choose Mana Confluence over City of Brass if I was only going to run 1. All said and done, I like to have 10 ramp cards in each of my decks. Getting that commander out a turn early is a great way to start a game. Okay, let's briefly talk about the mid to heavy green decks. These are the differences as compared to the greenless builds we were just talking about. For one, I would generally run a few more basic lands. This is because many of the green mana accelerators search out basic lands and put them onto the battlefield. I would take out things like Tri-lands and Have-lands and the Mana Confluence to make room for 5 more basics. I still prefer my ramp spells to be 2 mana whenever possible, so I would take out Signets and Talisman to make room for stuff like Farseek, Sakura Tribe Elder, and Nature's Lore. The important thing here is that the spells put lands directly onto the battlefield. Putting lands into your hand is fixing, not ramp. It does not help you cast your commander a turn early. Obviously, the usual Cultivate, Kodama's Reach, and Explosive Vegetation are still great, even given my preference for 2 CMC ramp because they are so efficient. Again, I still want 10 mana ramp effects total. I just want to upgrade where possible to the green versions. As a general rule in Commander, mass land destruction is not prevalent, so mana ramp that involves putting more lands onto the battlefield is safer than, say, having 3 Signets in play that could die to 1 Vandal Blast. So that's it, a general breakdown for a 4-color deck. Remember, of course, this is a guideline, a jumping off point, meant to help players who are having trouble constructing their own mana base. It's far from the only strategy, but it is a successful one. Make sure you check out the rest of the professor's videos on mana bases for more info regarding 2, 3, and 5-color decks. I hope very much this video has been of some help to you. If you want to help me out, subscribe to my channel, The Command Zone, where we go super in-depth on EDH topics and decks each and every week.
Here's the thing, if you want to go 100% in the direction of just straight combat, then this is, I think, definitely not one of the worst cards. It's one of the better cards. However, I've played enough games of Commander to know that just doing straight combat isn't going to win you the game, especially when, if this deck has 6 board wipes and you play this in the field against everyone else, your Tolarian Hydra is going to be great for 1 turn only before, it's like one of those cards that says, oh, it's time to use that board wipe I've been waiting for.
Yeah, no one's going to let you attack with it.
That's amazing.